Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. And it's time for me to talk about something I've been avoiding. This is my top 25 original Game Boy games of all time. Now, briefly, a minute or two tops, I have to talk about my experience with Game Boy. Because I didn't have a Game Boy when I was a kid. Number one reason I didn't have a Game Boy as a kid is my parents wouldn't buy me one because I had an NES and a Sega Genesis and they didn't see the need. The number two reason why I didn't have a Game Boy as a kid is because if they had bought me a game console, a handheld, I would have insisted on getting a Game Gear because a Game Boy hurts my eyes because it's fucking black and white. This middle finger's for Nintendo. You could have raised the price $30 and put a color screen on that goddamn thing and everything would have been fine. Especially when you're selling the Switch for $300 plus and you sold the Nintendo DS for $150 plus, and the 3DS for $200. You could have sold the Game Boy for $130 and it would have been fine. It still would have sold. You didn't have to cheap out. So my experience playing Game Boy games is not on a Game Boy hardware. I've never owned an original Game Boy, and I never will, because it's a piece of fucking rubbish. I will never own a Game Boy. I have no interest in it. However, it's got some unique games. It's got some fun games. My first experience with Game Boy games was playing on the Super Game Boy on the Super Nintendo, and then I carried that over to Game Boy Player on the GameCube, and I had a GBA that could play Game Boy games, so I got to play a few that way. So, my experience with the Game Boy library is mostly as console games, and I have played a few through emulation on the laptop. So, I have not experienced Game Boy as it was originally experienced, as it was intended to be experienced. So I have to mention that. So when I'm looking for Game Boy games, I'm not looking for a game to play on the bus to pass the time. I'm looking for a game that's going to hold my attention and give me a reason to play. So most of these games are going to be head scratchers. They're not a lot of them are going to be the typical usual games you'd expect to be on a top 25 Game Boy games list. Some of them will be obvious, and some of them will be like, interesting, why'd you pick that? So see my video about arcades and my experience with arcades for a further explanation on why I picked some of the games I picked. So number 25, one thing I do like about handhelds, and one thing I do like about mobile gaming in particular, is the puzzle games. And the first game on the list, number 25, is Yoshi's Cookie. Yoshi's Cookie is an interesting kind of puzzle game in that it's basically columns with a different paint coat. But it plays like columns, more or less. And I like columns. I had it on the Genesis. Number 24 is a typical Nintendo platformer. It's Wario Land. Full title is Super Mario Land 3 Wario Land. I like platformers. I like side-scrollers. I like 2D games, so this made the list. Number 23, going back to the arcades, is Space Invaders. If I'm going to sit down and play a Game Boy game, I want an arcade game. And Space Invaders is one of the good ones. It's one of the arcade games people remember. Number 22 is a game I discovered through YouTube, through various means, and I tried it out myself, and it was fun. It's called Penguin Wars. This is a decidedly unique Game Boy experience, so I'll give you that. This is a game that was made for the Game Boy. Number 21 would be higher on my list if it weren't for the fact that, again, this machine is fucking black and white. And the game itself is known for its colors, being a colorful game. And it's Miss Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man being the better of the two classic Pac-Man games, and my personal favorite. But on a Game Boy screen, it's not as fun. Also, the resolution sucks, so you don't get the whole maze. So there's a lot of scrolling, and that's disorienting to me. Number 20 is another Nintendo first-party title that is more or less a handheld port of a console game. This is Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. I have played this game. It was fun. I haven't beaten it, but I don't beat a lot of games anyways. But I had fun playing it while I did. Number 19 is a game that, a franchise in fact, that originated on the Game Boy. It's since been ported to everything that Nintendo makes in some form or another, but it started on the Game Boy. And this is Kirby's Dream Land. Now, truth be told, I had the NES version of this game, which is more or less the same game, just, with colors. I'm going to keep bringing that up every chance I get. Number 18 is Game & Watch Gallery 2. Now, this is the only Game Boy game I'll forgive for not having any colors, because the Game & Watch didn't have any color either. So this is basically true to form. This is, accurate to its original presentation. Number 17 is another game that made the list despite being a colorful arcade game, and this version not having any colors again, which makes it hard to play because it's hard to tell what you're doing. But it is a classic game and it's still a lot of fun. This is Frogger. I had Frogger on the Sega Genesis. Frogger is not a current gen game to have been released on the Sega Genesis, but yet it was. And I still played it because it's fun. It's a fun game. Number 16 is a game that is a combination of an arcade port of an existing game, but also an original Game Boy title. And this game is also unique in that it took advantage of the Super Game Boy exclusive features. And this is Donkey Kong. Now, Donkey Kong Game Boy is not just an extension of the original Donkey Kong. It's also the introduction of what would become the Mario vs. Donkey Kong franchise. Even though it's relatively primitive compared to the subsequent games in the franchise, it's still a fucking classic. Where are we? Number 15 is another port of, more or less, of a home console game, but it's also reformatted for the Game Boy to take advantage of the Game Boy's limitations and be fun on the Game Boy despite its limitations, lack of color, shitty resolution, awful controls, etc. This is Super Mario Land 2. 6 golden coins. One of the better platformers on the console. Now, number 14, you're going to scratch your heads. Why did it go higher on the list than Mario Land 2? Again, we're going back to the fucking god-awful decision to not have colors on a fucking game console at a time when color was standard. This is Game & Watch Gallery. And the only reason why this one is just a little bit higher than Super Mario Land is because Mario is a colorful fucking game. Game & Watch, again, doesn't have colors. So Game & Watch feels at home on the Game Boy, whereas Mario feels out of place. Number 13 is another arcade game that works, on the Game Boy, but works better on like the Super Game Boy or the Game Boy Player, but it's playable on a Game Boy. This is Centipede, another arcade classic that you can get away with not having colors because the graphics are primitive enough, you can tell what's going on. Number 12 is another hybrid. It's kind of a port, of an existing console game, but it's also kind of, more accurately, a sequel to the console game. So it's like a continuation of that. And it's Metroid 2. Metroid 2 feels like it was made with the Game Boy in mind. Nintendo said, let's make a Game Boy game. And somebody drew up a roadmap for Metroid 2, and they just went with it. Number 11 is one of the handful of third-party games that's going to make the list that isn't technically an arcade game. This is Castlevania 2 Belmont's Quest. I picked this one because I played all of the Castlevanias on the Game Boy. And shoot me, I don't care. This is the only one that's any goddamn fun. Number 10 just barely made the list. And it made the list because, one, I needed a fucking game at number 10. And there's hard to come up with that many good Game Boy games because there's not that many good Game Boy games. There's not, let's be honest. It's Bomberman Game Boy. Bomberman, again, is a game that needs color, and it doesn't have it here. So you can't tell who's the red Bomberman. There is no red Bomberman. There is no blue Bomberman. It's just fucking gray Bomberman versus gray Bomberman. That's for Nintendo. $30, assholes. $30. You could have put a color screen in this thing, and it still would have fucking sold gangbusters. There was no excuse to have a black and white screen. Lynx was in color. Game Gear was in color. Everything that was on the market at the same time was in color. I'm sick of this. Number 9 only makes the list again because it was unique to the Game Boy. And this one doesn't depend on colors as much. And this is Blaster Master Boy, which is a unique take on a very obscure NES game. Number 8 makes the list because it's a fun game. Again, the NES game is better. And again, this game suffers from lack of colors because this is a sports game. And you can't tell Team A from Team D because they're both wearing gray jerseys instead of green and yellow like they should be. This is Blades of Steel. And yes, I'm going to keep bitching about this lack of color because god damn it should have had color. And it fucking suffers from not having color. Number 7 is Batman the video game. What else can I say? This was on Genesis. This was on Nintendo. This was on everything. This is the probably best Batman game ever made. Number 6 is one that, to be fair, the arcade game didn't have color, so it works on the Game Boy. I'll give them this one. Asteroids. Asteroids doesn't need color because it didn't have color to begin with, so no need for colors there. Number 5 almost works. It's a fun game, and it works on the Game Boy because, again, limitations of the resolution. There's not a lot to the graphics. It's just blocks. It's just blocks and a pixel. It's basically single-player Pong is what it is. This game is called Alleyway, and it is so fucking primitive that it works on the Game Boy because it was designed to be primitive. It's basically a Breakout clone. Which, again, doesn't really need colors because it's just bricks. It's just blocks. Number 4 is probably the best original Game Boy game made by Nintendo. And I have to put an asterisk on that. Made by Nintendo. And it's Super Mario Land. This was a launch title. This was the first game most people played. And it still works. Super Mario Land is a very good game on the Game Boy. Now, it's still frustrating because you can't tell the red turtles from the green turtles because there are no red and green. Because, what the fuck? But whatever. Number 3 is another one that doesn't just accentuate the fact that there's no colors. It fucking throws it in your goddamn face. This is Pokemon Blue. It's in the fucking title. The game is supposed to be in color, and it's not. Pokemon Blue is, I don't care what, at me, I don't fucking come at me in the comments. Pokemon Blue is the only Pokemon game in the history of Pokemon worth a shit. And it's the only one I'll play. Every other Pokemon game is just a goddamn knockoff of Pokemon Blue. Number 2 makes the list because, of course, it does. You've been waiting for me to say number 2. You were expecting it to be number 1, and it ain't. But we'll get there. Number 2 is fucking Tetris. Tetris is the game that sold the Game Boy. If you bought a Game Boy, if you were stupid enough to buy one in 1989, yes, I called you stupid, you did it to play Tetris. Which is sort of a, okay, fair enough. I'll give you that. Number one shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist because it depends on the colors. They're essential to the game. And again, it's a puzzle game. It is playable on the Game Boy. And again, its core gameplay, despite the lack of colors, is just fun enough that it's still playable. And the various shades of gray are distinct enough. While it is a pain in the ass to play, it's still fun. And like I said, I played it on a Super Game Boy with full color, so I didn't have the limitation of no fucking colors. And it's Dr. Goddamn Mario. Dr. Mario is better than Tetris in every conceivable way, and I'm not going to argue with you.